So first, thank you for having me here. I'm a chemist, so I'm going to tell you that right up front. And when I'll have a lot of chemistry in here, but I should be able to explain it since I also teach. And if I can't, boo me off stage. I'll have other things in here also. I'll show you how some basic science can go very quickly to the defense contractors. And I'm going to take one little side tour to show you something we invented based off of this, which is water splitting. So what I wanted to do many years ago was just split water, and water is H2O. And what we wanted to do is take water, and I was interested in energy storage. And so when you split water and rearrange the bonds of water, you get hydrogen and oxygen. And those are high energy fuels. And that's what photosynthesis does. So in case you never thought about it, when you give a plant water and the sunlight hits the leaf, the plant is only using the sunlight to split water. I know when we think about it, it was from grade school. Carbon dioxide plus water plus sunlight gives O2 and carbohydrate. But point in fact, the plant's not using sunlight to make carbohydrate. It's using sunlight to split water to hydrogen and oxygen because that's the uphill reaction energetically. Then once it has the hydrogen, it combines it with the carbon dioxide in the dark. And I'll show you that later on. But this was the hard reaction to do, and was to do using sunlight. And when I started working on this, it turns out these are some of the simplest reactions you can think of. Just 2 protons and 2 electrons make hydrogen. And so I've split this overall reaction up into its 2 pieces. So you split water and make O2. And then there's 4 protons and 4 electrons left behind, and you can combine the 4 protons and 4 electrons to make hydrogen. But that reaction actually was really complicated. First, it involves more than 1 electron, multi-electron. And I got my degree, my co-advisor when I was at Caltech was Rudy Marcus. He got the Nobel Prize for Marcus theory for a 1 electron reaction. The theory is just of 1 electron. And there's multi-electron. And then the other part is electrons and protons need to talk to each other. Now the reason they need to talk to each other is if they don't, you put huge energy barriers in to make splitting water to hydrogen and oxygen. So if I don't have an electron talking to a proton, I just take 1 proton and 1 electron, and then I add another electron and proton to run a reaction at 0 volts. So I have to put a voltage in. I told you this reaction is uphill. So the first way you start studying it is not using any solar supply. You just plug it into the wall and use electricity out of the wall. And to run that reaction, you need a battery or a voltage of 1.23 volts. And so it turns out the hydrogen piece is at 0 volts, and the water to O2 piece, that's the hard piece, that's 1.23 volts uphill. But even the easy piece, if you don't have both 2 electrons talking to 2 protons, you put huge energy barriers into this reaction. And when I started thinking about this science a long time ago, there was no theory that talked about how protons and electrons communicated with each other. And I'm just going to do one little technical thing. If you remember, people say sometimes electrons are wave-like. They spread out. And then protons, and so what happens for an electron, here's an electron and it's spread out. And then the electron went over here and it spread out. And how fast the electron can move is the overlap between these 2 wave functions. So electrons are wave-like and they decay exponentially. And then how fast they move is this overlap integral. But a proton is more classical, like Newtonian. because its mass is 2,000 times that of the electron. So its wave function for the same distance is hardly overlapped with each other. So what happens is, in what makes this problem difficult, is protons and electrons can't keep up with each other. The proton's really slow and the electron's really fast. So nobody knew how to study that. And so I'm just gonna break the problem down. Like, I wanna do water splitting, and then you find out there's no theory or theoretical framework that connects a proton to an electron. It just didn't exist. And as a matter of fact, nobody had ever timed a proton to an electron, believe it or not. And so with lots of students, we just broke this down in our head like a race. So say I was going to run against the world record holder in the 100-meter dash. That would be Usain Bolt. And the finish line's over there, and we're gonna start there. How could I ever beat him? You cheat. That's how you do it. So when you think of a race, you think we should both start out at the starting line at the same time. But we didn't. What we did is we told Usain Bolt, the electron, you start over there, and I'm gonna start right in front of the finish line. So when the gun goes off, I'm gonna get to the finish line at the same time he gets there. And that's exactly what we did. The gun was a laser, and when it went off, the proton only had to go a little bit, the electron had to go a long way, and then we have detectors, and we had them only at the finish line. We didn't watch the whole race. We just watched the electron and proton get to the finish line. And when we did that, we could start seeing how they talk to each other. And this is what makes science so cumbersome sometimes. To do that race I just told you, we had to make these really complicated molecules where the electron was running. So we had long spacers, and the electron started there, and then the proton just had to go, whoop, just jump right down there. And that's what we did. And then we could put detectors and see the electron and proton get to the same point at the same time, and we could start to see them talk to each other. And then that allowed us to build the first theories, oops, I went backwards, the first theories for proton-coupled electron transfer. And we did that. And we had to do that because if we didn't, we were gonna have these big energy barriers to split water to oxygen and hydrogen. And so this theorist, Bob Cukier, and I developed all the first theories of how protons and electrons talk to each other and coordinate their dance with each other, all right? In that field, I was just telling Sandra, when you take an electron and a proton off an amino acid in your body, you make a radical. And after we developed this theory, a whole new branch of biology started called radical enzymology. So when we started this, now remember, I was just doing water splitting, that's all I cared about. There was only 2 enzymes in the world that were thought to be radical based. And you might remember not long ago, people told you to drink lots of orange juice to stay reduced. That was to get rid of radicals, because they thought there were not any radical-based enzyme. Radicals were bad. Since we developed this theory, people then knew what to look for, and there's over 400 enzymes in your body that are reacting by radicals. So you don't want to be too reduced, or you'll stop working. So we got this proton-coupled ET thing down, and then a student in my lab, Matt Cannon, said we need to have something act on the water. So when we charge it up with electricity with this 1.2 volts, it has to split water to make oxygen. And Matt just took a metal, cobalt, put it in water, and then when he put a positive voltage on it, of a volt, we saw thin films form on an electrode. There's no sun here now, we just have it plugged in the wall. We have a conductor. And then when the conductor gets charged up to a volt, you see a thin film form when you have this metal ion, cobalt, in solution. And the thin film, once it was on the electrode, would make a lot of oxygen. And it took many years. We figured out what the thin film was made up. It was made up of these clusters of cobalt and oxygen, so that's number one. And it had a lot of interesting properties, but the one especially important to the GILS program is this catalyst could do this special thing called self-healing. And so what it can do is fix itself in real time, always fix itself. It turns out in nature, the active site that's in a leaf also knows how to heal itself. That's something nature does really well. But scientists, we don't do that very well. We don't know how to heal things. So why do you need to do healing? This is an old Navy problem, by the way. MIT, I used to be at MIT most of my life. The mechanical engineering department at MIT was established in the early 1900s off of Navy defense contracts to stop corrosion. Here's a little interesting side note. George Steinbrenner, who used to own the Yankees, and the Steinbrenner empire was shipbuilders, but it was their great-grandfather who was an MIT graduate who got all the first contracts from the Navy to stop corrosion. And that's how they built their shipbuilding empire. And this is the corrosion problem that George Steinbrenner's grandfather attacked. If you have metals, metals can go to oxides, and when you have an oxide, if I split water, I make O2, I have protons left behind. And the protons will react with the oxide, and if you have two more protons that add to oxygen, you make water, and then the oxide starts decomposing, and then the metal ions dissolve in solution. So that is what happens in any water splitting system with oxide. So first you need DI water, totally pure water, and you need to have base around, concentrated base, because you don't want the protons to attack your catalyst, the thing that's splitting water. So as soon as you make a proton, the concentrated base reacts with water and neutralizes it. So nobody had ever split water that wasn't DI water and that didn't have base around, okay? And when I started talking to Sandra and when I started thinking about this problem a long time ago, you can't tell plants to grow in concentrated base or divers to dive around in concentrated base because of this inconvenient problem that my catalyst will decompose. So what we set out to do is to make the first self-healing catalyst like nature works. And the short of it is, in all catalysts, and the catalyst is the material that's going to act on water, say, to split it, when if a catalyst deactivates, what we do in technology is we reactivate it. So if you go to a chemical engineering plant like Exxon, and you look at one of their refineries, everything is done in twos. Because when, for instance, they're going to crack gasoline or oil to make gasoline, they use catalysts to crack it. Then it dies, and so what they do is they just turn off a switch and they just put the flow through the second column. And then while that switch is turned off, they have to chemically put things into it to reactivate the catalyst. So that's how the world works in catalysis. What we decided is that we would put the chemical activation step energetically within this step. And the way we did that, ignore this complicated stuff, but what you can do is figure out what this is called the rate law. And so we can get kinetics. How fast is water getting oxidized to O2 or getting split? And what that top equation tells you is it's inversely dependent on the pH, so the concentration of protons. And you can figure that out using electrochemistry. So from these things called Tafel plots, if you do electrochemistry, you can look at things like the voltage as a function of how fast I'm making oxygen. That's on the y-x-axis. And I can look to see how fast do I make oxygen and what voltage do I make oxygen as a function of pH. We get this rate law for oxygen production. Then this poor student, I told you we just oxidized cobalt to cobalt-3 and it lays down on the electrode. He literally spent 5 years of his life to figure out what really happened. It's what you guys fund. And it took 5 years of his life, and he figured out that you do oxidize cobalt-2 in solution, but it's through this complicated reaction sequence that involves 3 protons. You need cobalt in solution. And then we had phosphate around our catalyst, and the phosphate has to dissociate. And then that allows a cobalt-2 to get oxidized by a cobalt-4 to make the cobalt-3,3. So before I said you take cobalt-2 to 3, it lays down on the electrode, but it's through this complicated reaction sequence. And the thing about this sequence is that red term, it's inversely dependent on 3 protons. Now, why did we spend 4 or 5 years figuring all this out? Because this allowed us to make the first self-healing catalyst. So in the blue line, that's the line for how you make oxygen. And the red line is how you self-assemble the catalyst from solution. So let's look at pH 7. We'll look at pH of seawater, anywhere between 5, say 6.5 to 7.5, but this entire green region, this is true. So let's just look at 7. I split water, so I have to apply a voltage to my catalyst to split water. I split water at 1.2 volts at pH 7. But to run Andrew's cycle for this assembly of the catalyst from solution, I only need at pH 7, 1 volt. So as long as I'm splitting water and making oxygen, if the catalyst falls apart, I have plenty of extra voltage to drive this self-assembly process. So say some of the cobalt in the catalyst begins corroding and dissolving back in solution, I can redrive it back onto the electrode because I only need a volt when I'm splitting water at 1.2 volts. That means this catalyst never dies, and it doesn't ever die. So as long as it's splitting water and making oxygen, that catalyst is stable forever. It never, ever, ever dies. But there are other advantages. One is I can use any water source. And I'll tell you in a minute at the end why I care about using any water source. But it works out of the Boston Harbor. That's a water source you guys would care about. It works out of the Charles River. It works out of wastewater, and it works out of urine. So I'll give you a little heads up, like why do urine? 2 reasons. First is when we did the Boston Harbor experiment, my student Yogi, who's now a professor at MIT, I said, Yogi, go find out if this works out of the Boston Harbor seawater. And I walked into the lab one day. See, this is what gets program managers really angry when you say, why do you need so much for materials and supplies? I walk in the lab and Yogi's ordered from Aldrich a 55-gallon drum of seawater instead of just driving down to the harbor and getting a glass of seawater. So I then made Yogi do the urine experiments. That's how I got that down. But this is the first catalyst that's ever split water. I know I showed you that complicated science for self-healing, but this is the first catalyst that's ever split water, just regular water, and made oxygen without corroding. The other nice thing with that is if I can I can use water, I open up a whole bunch of new possibilities in my life. So one is I'm splitting water to oxygen and hydrogen. I told you oxygen and hydrogen are both valuable things. If I could take those things, which is energy, and interface it to biology, I might be able to do something that's special that other people can't do. So by doing water splitting out of pure water, I can integrate with biology. The other piece is the materials piece. Right now, I only have a catalyst that splits water to O2. So I need to make hydrogen. And there's no energy supply in here. The energy supply is plugged into the wall, and I wanted to use a renewable energy supply. Again, with the target of helping the poor have energy. So I wanted to use sunlight. And if I'm going to use sunlight, I'm going to have to take my catalysts and integrate them with materials. And one material I wanted is silicon. And so if you're in neutral water, interfacing catalysis or water splitting to other materials becomes a lot easier than concentrated base or acid. So by doing the self-healing, you start opening up a materials world and a biology world that can be interfaced with oxygen and hydrogen generation from any water supply. So I'll show you the benefits of that. So first, let's just talk about the Boston Harbor. So this, and here's the Charles River and pure water. So you can see that because of this self-healing, this is oxygen generation. So here we're generating oxygen at 3.3 volts over the thermodynamic potential of 1.2 volts. So at 1.5 volts, we have a stable oxygen generation. This catalyst is nickel, for instance. If you want to do cheap water splitting, people will use nickel. But the problem is, once you go into things like Charles River, Boston Harbor, you get biofilms, and the catalyst stops working. And you can start to see you have to keep increasing the voltage, and then this thing isn't even stable. You can see it's drifting upwards. And that's literally because it's corroding and you're getting biofilm formation. On the catalyst I just told you, if you start forming biofilms, it breaks down a little and reforms all the time. So you can't make any biofilms on it. So you can see how stable the source is in terms of making oxygen. But just in the last year for Sandra, we designed a new experiment because making oxygen, say, out of seawater isn't good enough. There are other things in seawater, like chloride, salt. And if I'm electrolyzing water to make O2, and I electrolyze a little chloride and make chlorine, you don't want to breathe chlorine into your lungs. So making O2 from seawater is not enough. You have to make it selectively without making any harmful byproducts. And so what Thomas did under Sandra's program, we built an electrode. So here's your electrode that I can put a voltage on it and start generating oxygen. So say seawater comes in here in the red stream, it hits the electrode. We oxidize water to O2. The O2 gets entrained, so we made a little microfluidic device. The O2 gets entrained and comes over to here, it flows down here, and here's a membrane that we interface to a mass spectrometer. And so now what Thomas is able to do is, instead of looking at current, he can just put the mass spec at, say, the mass of oxygen. So as he scans a voltage, and here I get up to 1.2 volts, I told you that's what we need to see for oxygen. Now he sees current. The current could be due to any oxidation process, but in this experiment, the mass spec is the y-axis, and it can only see the O2. So we set the mass spec, in this case we used 18 oxygen isotoped water. So my oxygen, if it's coming from the water or not from my catalyst, I should get 36O2. So Thomas puts the mass spec at m over z of atomic number 36, and that's where we see oxygen. So then, this is our newest data, there's chloride in the water. So if he puts the mass spec at chlorine, if we see chlorine being generated as he scans, we should see an upward rise. And you can see it's perfectly flat. And the other thing, if you make chlorine in water, you can make hypochlorite, which is bleach. And you can see it's absolutely flat. And these spikes are the oxygen. So this is the mass spec set at oxygen, hypochlorite, and chlorine. And you can see this thing is totally selective for O2 generation. So this is a catalyst that you can start thinking about if it's powered, and we've done the calculations for Sandra. For 2.2 kilogram of a lithium battery, this catalyst will generate enough oxygen for a 1-hour active dive, metabolic dive. And by the way, I mentioned this today, lithium batteries are pretty energy dense, but they're not very good. There are much more energy dense batteries, but you never hear about them because they cost more. But that's not necessarily that's not the first concern for DoD. DoD is usually weight in this instance and performance. So 2.2 kilograms for a 1-hour active dive using this catalyst is an upper limit. I think we can go a lot less with weight, less than a kilogram probably. But we're fairly excited about this because this is all a consequence of making the first self-healing catalyst. And there's a lot of mechanistic work. You could ask, why is it nailing the chloride to make chlorine? We have an idea of that. We can figure it out. It depends on just how much of a workload, but we'll figure it out precisely probably in the next year. So the next issue is always you want to make oxygen faster and faster and faster. This gets into a little interesting area. What we've discovered, my catalyst has cobalt in it. We have another catalyst that's nickel, and it does it. When we put nickel in iron, it's even a better performing catalyst. When we put 5 different metals in it, it's even a better performing catalyst. We have a theory for why that is. But as you increase the complexity in metal, this overpotential or oxygen generation performance gets better and better and better. It turns out just with 5 different metals, if you take all the combinations, you're in millions and millions of catalysts. So how do you, as an experimentalist, do that? And then if I start changing ratios of all those 5, it just exponentially grows. And that field's been absolutely unexplored, is how the rate of oxygen varies with complexity of metals. And that's a perfect case for when you use machine learning and AI. So one of our future directions is actually to work with computer scientists to start narrowing this massive space down to get the ideal catalyst, for instance. And then there's one other little byproduct of this. When you split oxygen, you make hydrogen. And that's the throwaway. By the way, in the energy field, you want the hydrogen and you let the oxygen go. That's what photosynthesis does. But here, you want the oxygen and you don't want the hydrogen. So what can you do with that? So I'm going to show you a biological way, but you can start to invent catalysts that take the hydrogen and CO2 and make things like formate, and that's a salt that you could dissolve in water. So you could start imagining a system where you're making O2, the hydrogen you're generating, you combine with the CO2 coming out of the mouth, make a soluble salt, dump it in the ocean, and now I have a rebreather without carrying it on my back. So that's something I think is totally within reach with research, that you would take the H2 plus CO2 and eliminate, and then make a soluble product that gets dissolved in water, which is what effectively you're doing with a rebreather, except you're combining it with this concentrated oxide base on your back, and you got to keep carrying it. This you would just be breathing out into the ocean, not making bubbles, and let it dissolve. So I believe that's doable. I'm going to show you, I'm going to switch gears in a minute, that you can make H2 and CO2 and make liquid fuels, diesels, for instance, okay? That's even harder to do, but making soluble salts out of CO2 as a byproduct with hydrogen, I think, is within our reach. And you could get rid of a rebreather. All right, I want to take, and that's something we're going to pursue for Sandra in the next 2 years. Okay, I'm going to just do a little jump because a lot of times you hear academic people and it's blah, blah, blah. And then you're wondering, where does the rubber hit the road? And so this is going to sound a little weird. As we were trying to make the catalyst to split water, I told you we wanted the electrons and protons to talk to each other, so we had a low energy barrier. But we also realized, how about if we never split water, ever? I could take two compounds, and when I charged them up with voltage, they never made split water to make oxygen and hydrogen. So then you could ask, what good would that be? And this is what it's useful for. If I, instead of making really good catalysts that split water, I made compounds that collect charge but never split water, then I could use the sun. The sun hits a solar panel and generates electricity, and then I could send the electricity into 2 glasses of water, dissolve some compounds, these compounds that can't split water, and I could charge them up with the sunlight. So now I'm putting charge in metal complexes dissolved in water. That, in that regard, that's a battery. That's what you do with batteries. You charge up the anode and cathode, but it's solid state. The only difference here is my battery is it's compounds dissolved in water. Then at night, sun goes down, I can then discharge the compounds, when the sun's out, I'm going to put an electron in this compound and take an electron out of this compound. Then at night, the sun goes down, I'm going to take the electron back, and that's a downhill reaction. I pump the system uphill with the sun. So now I can collect the electricity at night, just like a battery. So in a battery, it discharges. You could use solar panels, recharge it, take it out. But now this is dissolved in water. And what you do is, here I just have a membrane in an external circuit. What you really do is you take the charged up materials dissolved in water, and then you flow them over a stack and you collect the electricity, and that's called a flow battery. And that's a big field. People have been studying that for 15 years, but they weren't really doing a good job of it because they didn't understand proton-coupled electron transfer. So we made compounds that did that. While we were trying to split water, we made compounds that could never split water, but you could dissolve in water and then charge them up. And I'm going to show you, where's the genesis of this? Yeah, I'll show you in a minute. So here it is. I'll start here. So in 2012, we made a thing this big. Actually, just before that, the cell was literally this big. So we had a little cell hooked up to literally 2 little glasses of water with the compounds in it and made this flow battery. And in 2012, this is a stack. So here are some hands. And we built this system up to here. This is what's called a 5 kilowatt stack in 2014. And then Lockheed Martin, which is, you all know, is a defense contractor, they started wondering, could they diversify? And they actually wanted this as an energy storage mechanism for forward operating bases and a commercial venture, because now a power company could use a flow battery and store electricity. So why is that important? You have a solar panel on your house. Now, if you generate electricity, it goes back to the power company, but they can't store it. So what they do is they trade it. So you remember Enron. Enron was an energy trader. There are real energy traders that haven't been dishonest and gone bankrupt. So Vitol, for instance. So what's happening when you have a solar panel, the electricity goes back to the power company, they sell it to a trader, they buy it low, and they find out over in Arizona needs it, and they sell it over there. That's how Vitol makes money off of energy trading. And that's the only way. That's why renewables haven't penetrated your grid, because you can't store it, so you can only trade it. And that's not a good market for a power company. But if they have a flow battery and it can store a lot of electricity, they can now say, we can store this many megawatts of energy. We'll put the solar panel on your roof. We won't even use government subsidy. I'm Lockheed Martin, for instance. I sell it to a power company. The power company can store 10 megawatts. They put the solar panel on your roof. You think you got it for free. And then they sell you electricity at night for your buyback price, and they put the price of the solar panel and a return on investment. So once a power company can store energy, it becomes a commodity for them. And Lockheed Martin realized that to diversify. At the time, we had built a 5 kilowatt stack, and that was for things like forward operating bases, small, or for the poor, like in India. That's what I was interested in. So they used it, saw it worked, and immediately said, forget your 10 kilowatt system, Nocera, we're gonna build a megawatt system. So in 2014, they bought Sun Catalytics, that's the company I had for water splitting. And if you go there now, on Lockheed's page, you'll see they have listed right up there with making missiles and planes and carriers, energy storage systems. And it's been really remarkable, but this is as of now, they built a 1.25 megawatt system, and in 2020, they're gonna have a 100 megawatt system, which will be the size of this entire suite and 3 or 4 stories high, and they'll be able to store 100 megawatts. So sometimes it's good, Sandra, not to split water. That's what the bottom line here is. But it does show that you can translate quickly if you get an early partnership. And I'm really proud of this because, you know, we took a major company, Lockheed Martin, and gave them a new business, which they're pretty appreciative of. As a matter of fact, the CEO told me one of the most asked questions is, why are you now listed in Cambridge? Because after they bought Sun Catalytics, they've been building it there in Cambridge, Massachusetts. We'll probably get moved to Dallas sooner or later. Okay, so that's if you don't want to split water. Let's get back to the CO2 piece with hydrogen. So I can split water and make oxygen and hydrogen, and I told you that's what the leaf uses sunlight for. At night, it takes the hydrogen, and nature stores hydrogen in a solid form. It's called NADPH. It's just solid hydrogen. And then it takes the hydrogen with carbon dioxide, and it makes carbohydrates or biomass that you can eat. So we've done the left side, but what can you do to do the right side? And so that's one problem. How do I make hydrogen and CO2 to biomass? Have no idea yet. And then secondly, here, I want to involve the sun. So the part that I've only done this piece without the sun. So how will I get the sun involved into this? So here's the water splitting catalyst that's self-healing to make oxygen. We made a catalyst. It took us 3 months to make a hydrogen catalyst. I told you that one's easier. So it took us only 3 months to do that. So now what you do is you split water, make O2. It leaves 4 electrons and 4 protons behind. Then the 4 electrons and 4 protons makes hydrogen. So we do that with this catalyst. But how do you get the sunlight in there? So what we did is we looked at your roof, and you think about what a solar panel is. It's silicon. And then you have a bunch of electrical engineers that have to wire up the silicon. And then when the sun hits the silicon, you get a positive charge going one direction, a negative charge going the other. Moving charge is current. And you have the current, and it powers stuff in your house. So sunlight hits the solar panel. It makes moving charge. The moving charge, you put wires on, collect the current, and you drive solar electricity. That's what you use your solar panel for. Sun goes down, no more electricity. So what we said is we'll get rid of the entire solar panel and we'll take just the guts of the solar panel, which is the silicon. And then when sun hits the silicon, it will make moving charge, but we won't wire it up. We'll put the catalyst I just told you about on each side. So on the positive side, where it will charge up the cobalt catalyst and make oxygen, and the negative side, it will charge up the other catalyst and make hydrogen. And we won't wire it. So that's what we did. This right here is amorphous silicon. And so we have 3 flavors of silicon. So silicon's what's in your solar panel, but we took 3 flavors. Amorphous silicon absorbs at 450 nanometers. And amorphous silicon has a strain lattice. That's why it absorbs at 400. And then what we started doing is doping germanium into it. And germanium is bigger than silicon, so it relaxes the lattice. And we keep doping germanium into it until we get to here. And then we take another piece of silicon and dope even more germanium in it and get to here. And these are the absorption profiles of the top piece of silicon, the middle piece, and the bottom piece. And you can ask, why did we dope so much germanium? How did we know when to stop doping? Because if you take this thing now absorbs light, and it absorbs that plus that plus that. So that's the total absorption profile. And that perfectly matches the solar spectrum. So with this 3 flavors of silicon, I catch every photon coming out of the sun. So now what happens? Just like in your solar panel on your house, the sun hits the silicon, and I get separated moving charge, and I get 1 unit of charge, and it gets injected into the cobalt self-healing catalyst that makes oxygen. The electron goes to the bottom. We set this up so it's biased. The electron goes down, and the hole goes up. The electron goes to the hydrogen catalyst, and that's 1 unit of charge, and I inferred before you need 4 units of charge to make oxygen, 4 holes and 4 electrons. So you do that 4 times, and when the cobalt gets charged up, oxygen comes out. And when the nickel hydrogen catalyst gets charged up, hydrogen comes out. And now I'm not plugging it into the wall. I'm just using the sun. And it really works. So that's a wafer. The silicon's around 100 microns of silicon. Where's my thing? 100 microns of silicon. And then it has a thin layer of coating of the catalyst on each side. So here's sunlight hitting this. And this is the front face with the cobalt. That's oxygen bubbling off. And this is out of the Charles River water. And then the electrons go to the back, and the hydrogen's bubbling off. And that's a dumb design, because I'm letting them mix. But if you want the oxygen and hydrogen, you just put a separator right inside. And so now I'm running the solar photosynthetic reaction when you give a plant water, except I'm doing one thing better than nature. Because I'm absorbing the entire solar spectrum, I'm generating hydrogen and oxygen at 13% energy efficiency. So I know how much sunlight, how much energy is hitting the silicon wafer. I can then measure the energy and the amount of hydrogen and oxygen I've made, and I'm at 13% sun into hydrogen and oxygen. Now, you could use the hydrogen in a fuel cell, and you could power things with it. But the problem is, the hydrogen, to use it, say I wanted to use it all in this building, I would need to put fuel cells in this building. And by the way, that's what SunCat set out to do. And I could make hydrogen at $4.50 per kilogram of hydrogen. So why is that an important number? 1 kilogram of hydrogen equals 1 gallon of gasoline in energy content. So in 2011, I was making 1 gallon gas equivalent of hydrogen at $4.50. And things looked great. And then guess what happened? Fracking. So right now, the cost of hydrogen from frack gas, because we don't put a price on CO2, is $1.42. So that wiped me out. And then the second thing is the investor. So the person who invested, a major investor, was Mr. Tata of India. But then all the American investors didn't want to do this because they said, wait a minute, Nocera, now you have to go and I have to go pay to put fuel cells in everything. And now you know why I pivoted the company and we made the flow battery. That's literally why because I couldn't argue with them. Like, yes, you have to put fuel cells everywhere. And then they said, see ya. And so I said, okay, we've learned all this stuff, we'll inverse design. And that's when we made the flow battery and gave it to Lockheed Martin. So that's the real truth behind what happened. But I didn't give up on hydrogen. So with CO2, I said you can make things like fuels. So that's what nature does. So here's the water splitting piece, and you get oxygen and hydrogen, and that's where all the energy is stored. When you take the hydrogen and combine it with carbon dioxide, you make biomass, but that's not storing energy. That's just storing hydrogen. So once you split water, H2 plus CO2 to glucose is zero volts. It's thermoneutral. Any fuel you make, including gasoline, is energetically downhill. H2 plus CO2 to gasoline is downhill energetically. That's why you can run it in the dark. So what did we do? We looked back at photosynthesis and said, here's the photosynthetic membrane and this big enzyme complex called photosystem 2, cytochrome B6F, it's an electron transfer piece. Over here is photosystem 1. That whole part of photosynthesis is just to split water to oxygen and hydrogen. I can offload it because I have the artificial leaf now, and I'm doing it way better than nature. But I have hydrogen, and then hydrogen powers, NADPH powers ATP synthesis, which is cellular energy. It uses the ATP to drive an enzyme then to take CO2 plus hydrogen to make biomass. So I have the hydrogen-oxygen piece, but how am I going to get hydrogen into a cell to start having it work with CO2 and make something? So this is a schematic now. I have photosystem 1 and 2. I can get rid of it because I have the artificial leaf to split water. But now I have hydrogen. How the heck do I make it power a cell? So what we did is we turned to synthetic biology. I told you I can now interface to biology. So what we did is we know, because of genomics, we know all these gene sequences. And we know what the gene sequence is to make an enzyme called a hydrogenase. And what the hydrogenase enzyme does is it takes H2, the 2 protons and 2 electrons. That's all it does. It just undoes the hydrogen reaction. So we took this bacteria called Ralstonia eutropha, it's a bacteria, and we genetically engineered it to have hydrogenases in the membrane. And then this poor bacteria dies if it doesn't have hydrogen. Its only food source can be hydrogen now. It can't eat anything else because I've messed it up with synthetic biology. But once it eats the hydrogen, I can make NADPH, and then with NADPH, I can make ATP, and I can power cycles. So that's what these people did. We took Ralstonia eutropha, and you could get to this thing called acetocoenzyme A, and you make biomass. So what happens is, I can take this glass of water, I can just throw a pinch of bacteria in there, and then I use solar, I use my artificial leaf, use sunlight to split water to oxygen and hydrogen, feed the hydrogen in the glass, and then the bacteria begin multiplying because they're eating. So 2 go to 4, 4 go to 8, and you get an exponent, and I can grow biomass. But the other thing we did is at this branch point, we put in 4 other genes, and those genes put in 4 different enzymes, and those enzymes take this acetyl coenzyme A, and they make a liquid fuel, isopropanol. Isopropanol is what you have in rubbing alcohol. Ethanol is a C2 carbon. You mix that with gas. This is a C3 alcohol. So these bugs, this is what you do. You use my catalysts, my oxygen catalyst and hydrogen catalyst. You hook it up to a solar panel, or you use the artificial leaf directly. That generates hydrogen. The bugs eat the hydrogen. They breathe CO2 in from the atmosphere, and either they grow, or if I use the other gene sequence, they make liquid fuels. And so that's what this is doing. The bugs eat hydrogen. They go into an exponential growth phase, so they're growing, growing, growing. Then we back off on the hydrogen, so some die, some live. We go steady state, take all the extra hydrogen, and they make a liquid fuel. So the bugs are literally pulling carbon dioxide in from the air. They're eating my solar split hydrogen, and they're making liquid fuels. And this graph 2 years ago made a lot of press. Matter of fact, Bill Gates started tweeting it. I had to write to him and tell him to stop, because every time he tweeted it, I literally would get 100,000 emails in less than 10 minutes. This guy, I think, has 8 billion followers, and there's only 7 billion people on the planet. So why did he like this? Because he had said, someday will be better than photosynthesis, and some kid, he was on PBS, and some kid said, what are you talking about? It's already been done by a professor at your old school. And the reason is my biomass grows at 10.2%. The best growing crops grow at 1%, like soy and switchgrass. So we beat out nature, natural. Our photosynthesis is 10 times better than natural photosynthesis. And we can make liquid fuels. Isopropanol kills bacteria, so we made C5. This is isopentanol. C5 fuel separates from water. So this is taking CO2 plus hydrogen, making fuels. What I told you now, I just want to take CO2 and hydrogen, make formate, and dump it in the ocean. That's why I'm pretty sure I can do this. And I don't want to use bugs. We'll use an inorganic system. But this is a way to do renewable fuel production. This purple bar, I'm about to end in a few minutes. I want to keep the purple bar. That's not a liquid fuel, that's a bioplastic. And that is stored inside the cells. So the bacteria breathes in CO2, it takes hydrogen from water splitting, and it makes a plastic that's stored in the cell. I'll show you why that's important. Because then I'm giving the cell its own fuel supply, and it can store it inside as a plastic. I'll show you why that's important in a minute. I haven't published this yet. We just did this in the last 3 months, especially for things like heavy-duty trucking, jet fuels. We've engineered bugs to make C10 and 12s and 8s as gasoline. And then if we use a different cycle, we can make 11s and 13s and 15s, which are diesels and jet fuels. And that's all renewably made at high energy efficiency. So this is pretty nice. Because I'm not competing with crops, my biomass. I'm growing my biomass in reactors, so I don't have any of the crop problems. Because I'm 10 times better than nature, my footprint is 10 times tinier. And I don't have the problem of algae, like algal fuels, because every algae needs to see sunlight. My bacteria are in the dark eating hydrogen. The only thing that needs to see sunlight is my artificial leaf. So we like that. What else is in air that you might want? Nitrogen, because nitrogen plus hydrogen makes ammonia, which is fertilizer. And the way you do it is you use big Haber-Bosch plants at $2 billion a plant. So what we decided is, could we take a bacteria, this is a different bacteria, we're going to have them eat hydrogen from solar water splitting and CO2, and they're going to make a fuel, but now they're going to make that bioplastic and store it inside itself. So you can think about it, we take bacteria and make them fat on the sun. We literally give them fat. The fat is polyhydroxybutyrate from carbon dioxide and hydrogen. So now you have these chunky, obese, energy-filled cells, and they can draw on the polyhydroxybutyrate, and then we tell them, breathe in nitrogen, use the hydrogen from the polyhydroxybutyrate, and make fertilizer. So that's what we do. We still use the bionic leaf, this thing where we split water to make hot. This is using my artificial leaf, feed the hydrogen to the bug, it breathes CO2, but instead of making a liquid fuel now, it makes polyhydroxybutyrate. That white blob is the bioplastic inside the bug. Once it has that, it never needs to see the sun anymore, because I've now preloaded it with solar fuel. It can then just eat the polyhydroxybutyrate and fuel these black things, which is it's an enzyme called nitrogenase. And nitrogenase takes N2 plus hydrogen and makes ammonia. So since they have their own internal energy supply, I should be able to put them in the ground, and I should be able to grow crops, and that happens. So we take these bugs, we put them in the ground, and we can actually do fertilization directly from nitrogen in the air. And you can see here, these are radishes, and we're getting 300% increase in crop yields from these bugs in the ground. They're a living biofertilizer that's totally sustainable. And it's distributed. So this is good for poorer parts of the world, like Africa, India, and that's where I'm working a lot right now, because they don't need large infrastructures now to grow crops and make fuels. They don't need ExxonMobil plants there. The other nice thing about what I just showed you is after it eats the polyhydroxybutyrate, guess what it leaves in the ground? Carbon. And the carbon came from CO2. So in this fertilization cycle, this is just a experiment, you make a lot of CO2 now due to fertilization because you use natural gas to get your hydrogen plus nitrogen. I've just gotten rid of the natural gas. You're using renewable hydrogen from my water splitting. And then after it pulls in the CO2, the bug eats the PHB. When it's done with PHB, it dies. It's gone. Then I have to put new bugs. That's why it's like a fertilizer. But the carbon is left in the ground, so I'm actually sucking carbon out of the air. I'm sequestering it. And if we look at the rates of CO2 sequestration to make the PHB in fertilization, if you were to use this fertilizer in the US, you would suck out a gigaton of carbon from the air. And that's what you need for fertilization. I'm done. So, it's at 2 o'clock. And so this says you can actually think about now distributed fuel and food production for the poor, and they don't need a large infrastructure. So we're really happy. And we're doing it 10 times better than nature. So with that, we're very happy about this. But the rudiments of this now is to take CO2 and hydrogen and make soluble salts, like I told you. And I think we'll be able to pull that off in the next year. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. I'll answer any questions.